Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Learning Salon. We are super excited to have our first primatologist, and Dr. Kirsty Graham is here with us today. Before I introduce her, I just want to say that if it's your first time here, the Learning Salon is a weekly forum where we gather with interdisciplinary colleagues to discuss the contentions and bridges between biological and artificial learning. And it's definitely a place where we are discussion oriented. The speaker usually gives about a 15-minute talk, and Kirsty, it's not a hard stop. So if you have more to show, feel free. We wouldn't entirely cut you off at 15 minutes. And then we spend about 2 hours or more just discussing it. So it's a little bit different from usual talk formats. You can consider this a place to really discuss ideas. If you're a junior person, you should feel free to ask clarification questions in the chat, but your actual questions in the Ask a Question area. And questions that are in the Ask a Question area, vote on each other's questions. The highest upvoted questions, we would invite you on screen later on to join the discussion after the three of us ask a couple of questions. Remember to show everyone respect. Disagreement, even intense disagreement and sometimes fun disagreement, is definitely encouraged. But disrespect is completely discouraged, or, making fun of others. So it's one thing to laugh together, but laughing at each other, it's kind of like we sort of frown on that. With that said, I'm very excited to introduce Kirsty, because I personally, and John was saying this too, there was a phase in my life where I constantly felt like, I could be a primatologist, but at some point I decided that I probably couldn't, given my I'm Iranian, my visa situation wouldn't have allowed me to travel much. But I kept reading Franz de Waal books, or kept in many discussions bringing up the distinction between bonobos and chimpanzees and their social and political hierarchy as an example of the fact that the human nature is not fixed, and because we're equidistant to them. So I'm very excited to have, for the first time on the Learning Salon, someone who actually works on communication in chimps and bonobos. Something that I would say is that, so we usually give fun introductions. So instead of saying that Kirsty is a postdoc at St. Andrews, I'd like to say that she also used to do stand-up, and she once dressed as a chimp for Soapbox Science. And she has also been doing skateboarding before the pandemic. But during the pandemic, as you can see in her background, she's growing a jungle inside her home. And that's it. With not much else to say, I am just going to give you the stage. So if you want to share your screen and your presentations, we are excited to hear from you.
Perfect. I have that slightly awkward moment where I'm clicking through everything to share the screen.
Well, we can say something so that it's not awkward. Oh, that was fast.
I figured this out quickly. Okay, my PowerPoint should be up now.
We see it.
Cool. So I'm going to talk a bit about meaning and context in great ape gestures. I went through this presentation a bit earlier today and sort of added some bits about the nuts and bolts of how we study gestures, because I think that's really important also in how we conceptualize things like meaning and context. So I think that's probably something useful to chat about.
One thing, if you press hide on the bar below, it's because we are already missing some of the thing on the left side. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So jumping straight in at the deep end, how do we study gestures? So the first thing is to go out and film some primates for a very long time. So my PhD research, I spent a total of 12 months with the bonobos and filmed at every possibility. Like anytime two bonobos approached within 5 meters of each other, I was filming them. Video is really important for intra-observer reliability, so that when I code the gestures, I can then have a second person code them, and we can compare how we've coded, which gesture types we've coded, sort of how long the gestures were, whether individuals looked at one another before gestures, the sort of different behaviors that we're looking for around that. So video is crucial to be able to do intra-observer reliability. It's also really important for collaborations. So in the pandemic, there's now huge collaborations where we're able to share archive video footage with one another and continue to do this kind of research despite not being able to travel and collect new data. And it's also important for future-proofing data sets. So the way we code videos now, we do it sort of manually, where we are using software like Elan or Boris or Solomon or the Observer, but I'll talk a little later about sort of future avenues for how we might start to think about coding videos with other types of software. So you've gone out, you filmed your primates, you get back and you code all those videos also for a very long time. So I think going through my videos took like a year of video coding, possibly more, to get through all of them. Originally, I was coding with FileMaker, but I'm now working with Elan. And I've just grabbed an example from the Elan documentation here to give you an idea of what video coding looks like. So you have the software, the video comes up, we have the sort of the timeline in the bottom, and so you can select a time frame for your video and then code various behaviors within it, and then that exports into a CSV or spreadsheet file. But this is basically what we're talking about when we're talking about video coding, watching the videos through and recording behaviors at certain time as we see them. So we've coded all of the gestures, all of those individual gesture instances, and so the next thing that we do is we catalog them. So for great apes, all great apes use gestures to communicate. Gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, chimpanzees, and humans all use gestures. Gestures are movements of the limbs, head or body. They're not mechanically effective. So me reaching out and picking up my mug of tea is not a gesture. I've used my own movement to mechanically achieve what I wanted to. If I had reached towards the cup of tea and waited and someone had come and picked it up and given it to me, my reaching towards the tea would have been a gesture. So all of those gesture instances that we've coded, we then categorize into gesture types. Things like an arm raise or an arm swing or rocking. There's around 70 gesture types for bonobos and chimpanzees. We categorize the gesture types based on the action and the body part. So you could have a swing with the arm or with the leg. You could have shake with hands, arms, legs, head. So we're categorizing them based on the action and the body part. So this is somewhat a newer way of categorizing them, which might come up a bit later in how we were previously categorizing them as more of a holistic approach. We're trying to break it down a bit more so that we can compare specific actions and the body parts that are used. And in future, so this is what I was referring to a little bit with the video coding, how like we're using these software, but ultimately we are doing it manually by watching the videos and entering the behaviors as we see them happen. In future, we might be able to get into more detail of gesture actions and gesture types with programs like Deep Lab Cut, which allow us to label different body parts and track their movement through space. It's currently still quite challenging, particularly with sort of videos in the forest where there's branches and everything in the way, shaky cameras, bonobos sort of cutting across in front of one another. But I think it's hopeful that we're reaching a point where Deep Lab Cut and programs like that are starting to be able to pick up behavior as well as just proximity between individuals. So here are a couple of videos to give you an example of the arm raise gesture, and to show that when we're comparing bonobos, so this is a video of a bonobo playing at the top left, raising their arm above their head. And when we're comparing the bonobos to chimpanzees, which is the video playing now, that we really are comparing these same gesture types, and an arm raise is the same whether we're coding it in a bonobo across individuals and bonobos, but also when we're comparing to chimpanzees. So when we look at the overlap between bonobos and chimpanzees in terms of the repertoire, like their vocabulary of gestures, there's roughly a 90% overlap. So this was comparing bonobos at Wamba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to chimpanzees at Badongo in Uganda. And so for these two populations, we found roughly a 90% overlap. The project that I'm currently involved in with Kat Hobater in St. Andrews is trying to expand that to other communities and to other species as well, so that we can really gain a fuller picture of how much these repertoires overlap. But the fact that these repertoires overlap so much might indicate that there's some sort of inherited component to them. Next, how do we study meaning? Well, we look at how the recipient responds. So an individual gives a gesture like this big loud scratch. The recipient comes and starts to groom that individual. So how the recipient has reacted and that the signaler is satisfied with that reaction because they've stopped gesturing and have moved on to this change of behavior with the recipient. Allows us to assign the meaning to the gesture. So in this instance, the gesture was a big loud scratch, and the meaning or the intended outcome was to initiate grooming. And when we take all of the gesture instances and look at the outcomes that they achieve, I was able to assign meanings to 33 of the gesture types. We had enough examples for those. And so half of them, it's 17 of the gestures had a single meaning, and 16 of the gestures had multiple meanings, which is quite interesting. We have sort of this set of gestures where they achieve the same outcome 100% of the time, and this other set of gestures almost, if we think of it that way, that are ambiguous, that have multiple meanings. And when we compare the bonobo gesture meanings to the chimp gesture meanings, there is also quite a strong overlap, so more than would be expected by chance. I think what's interesting to note in the matrix here on the left is that the gestures that had stricter meanings were the ones that overlapped more completely. So the gestures like push, punch other, present groom, present climb on, mouth stroke, that had only one or two meanings, had a complete overlap between bonobos and chimpanzees. And the ones with more ambiguous meanings, like arm raise, touch other, and arm swing, had less overlap. I think this might have something to do with the context in which gestures occur and how context interacts with meaning. So how do we study context? Going back to meaning is taken from the change in behavior of the recipient after the signal, which satisfies the signaler. And then context is additional information from the social environment right before or at the time of signaling. So I broke this down into behavioral context, which is the behavior of the signaler immediately before the gesture. And interpersonal context. So this is demographic characteristics like age, sex, and rank of signaler and recipient. So when we look at gestures that have multiple meanings that are apparently ambiguous, when we looked at those in specific behavioral contexts, all of the gestures disambiguated in at least one context. So whatever the signaler was doing before they gestured, that impacted the outcome of the gesture, the meaning of the gesture. So there are two gesture types here that are fully disambiguated by behavioral context, but all of them are disambiguated in at least one context. And where they are not disambiguated, so that where the meaning doesn't become clear in different contexts, interpersonal context then seems to play a role. So whether the individuals are young individuals signaling to adults, adults to young, male to female, female to male, or female to female. So interpersonal context also plays a role in disambiguating the meaning of gestures. Cool. So it's quite unusual doing quite a short talk. I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. To summarize, bonobos and chimps share the majority of their gesture types. Around 90% of their gesture repertoires overlap. Chimpanzee and bonobo gestures share many of the same meanings, and particularly the ones that have only one or two meanings. There's more overlap there than there is for the ambiguous gestures. But gestures that seem to have multiple meanings have specific meanings in different contexts. Context seems to disambiguate these gesture types that have multiple meanings, and that might play into the species differences if we consider how the social lives of bonobos and chimpanzees differ. The next sort of question that we're hoping to answer in our research group is, what about other great apes? How do they fit in? And also humans, how do we fit into this picture of gestural communication? So I'd like to thank everyone who helped to collect this data, all of my collaborators and funders. And I thought I would end with just a cute little bonobo video that I think represents how many of us are feeling right now.
I couldn't really see the video. It was very sort of, for me at least, it was sort of Laura's or sort of robotic.
I'll post it on Twitter. It's a little bonobo falling off a log.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you packed your sort of longer talk into a shorter period of time. And I feel like for those who didn't manage to read your wonderful review, Scratching Beneath the Surface, Intentionality in Great Apes Signal Production, I think it might be fun to maybe give a summary of some of the points that I personally very much enjoyed reading in that paper. And I feel like it might be even lacking in some discussions of language and communication or context or meaning in psychology. And so maybe we can, in order for the audience to get a better sort of appreciation of the wonderful work that you did in that and in your other paper that you sent us, maybe perhaps, and not to put you on the spot, I'll just like maybe try to summarize quickly my poor understanding, and you can like maybe help me to capture that. I really liked that you discussed the challenges of defining intentional communication, and you identified intentionality, first dating it back to Franz Brentano, and then who referred to it as puzzles of representation, linking the philosophies of mind and language. And then you mentioned Searle and Grice, who reinterpreted intentionality and how it might apply to actions and communication, moving it beyond Brentano's original formulation. And then you focus on the fact that, particularly because of Dennett's Gricean view and also the Grice's influence, basically the non-linguistic communication systems are deemed intentional based on Grice's view. And in that view, the way that Dennett has captured it, there is zero-order intentionality that requires no mentality, and it could be just reactive. Like maybe it just so happens that I vocalize every time like I see something, and it has nothing to do with the communication. And then you have the first order intentionality, and that has some criteria that you very wonderfully capture throughout your paper, and in the tables with the reviews of previous work, you show which ones actually have empirical criteria and which one don't. And then for the first order, you have very clear criteria, 3 criteria. First, a signaler has to act with the goal to communicate to a recipient. The signaler should try to have a volitional control under their, for instance, monitor for their attention. So if John is not paying attention to me, I would say, John, did you hear what I said? and then John smiles, then I know that he was listening, so I can now continue. So I'm adjusting my utterance to the recipient's attention by checking and making sure that he listens. And then one thing that you mentioned was checking for behavior. For instance, John looked at the camera and smiled, which tells me that he actually showed a behavior that shows he was paying attention. And then finally, that the recipient alters their behavior in a way that's in line with the signaler's goal. So for instance, if John pays more attention, now I'll know that like this, sorry, John, I'm just doing this to make a tangible example. So I think that was wonderful that
you're talking about my favorite
there
subject,
you go.
so I have to be part of it. Yeah.
See, John's favorite action by me is me trying to get John's attention. So this works. So this was the first order, and you were saying that in some behavioral markers, in some studies, it's actually not distinguishable from zeroth order, and that was an interesting thing in the paper that you mentioned. And then you went on to mention that producing signals in private as opposed to when some other animal is around, between humans and other animals is a huge difference. You wonderfully go into details about not just bonobos and chimps or humans, not just macaques. You go into fish, you go into fireflies and how they show some kinds of intentional communication. For instance, because some species of male fish, they don't show as aggressive behavior towards other males when a female is around. Or some squirrels show, some female squirrels give more danger calls when their offspring is around. And you show that because of the fact that there is a difference, this might be first order. Now, I have so many questions about all of this, and that's partly the reason I'm kind of mentioning this. So you go on and you provide wonderful tables. And then finally, you mention what are the challenges here in existing work and what's the road ahead. So did I capture it right? I'd love to see if you have, sorry to put you on spot like this. That's why I gave my crappy introduction of your, my summary of your paper. So if you could add something to it, if you correct me, if I said something that wasn't correct.
No, that was wonderful. Can you summarize all of my papers for me, please? I guess like one of the things to consider about intentionality is how different types of communication have focused or not focused on it. So gestures, and part of like operationalizing a gesture and like what we consider to be a gesture is that it has to be intentional. So it has to be an intentional form of communication. And so this list of criteria that we have to sort of demonstrate intentionality came out of the gesture literature. Because to distinguish gestures from other actions, that intentional communication is really important. And so then there are like Exercising Grice's Ghost by Townsend et al. Is an excellent paper that sort of tries to take those criteria that have been established for gestures to expand it to other types of communication, like vocalizations. Which I think is really interesting because there are some aspects of like vocalizations being broadcast to like a wider audience where gestures are used and can be used in a dyadic context where other individuals may not be aware that you're communicating. Vocalizations are more broadcast, and so there are some of the criteria that we use for intentionality may not be appropriate for vocalizations because of the sort of difficulty in understanding who the audience is and who the intended audience is. But then on the other hand, and one of the things that we were sort of bringing into this paper is that vocalizations are much more testable. So things like playback experiments or the like predator presentation experiments to elicit alarm calls, there's more that you can do to experimentally manipulate vocalizations than we can do for gestures. And so some of the cognitive questions around intentionality, because of trying to get that experimentally, actually vocalizations in great apes might be a more appropriate type of communication.
You also mentioned about second order intentional communication, which is the case where the signaler calls to inform an ignorant audience member about something. So it's only trying to transfer knowledge or change mental state rather than necessarily behavior. And you mentioned in your paper that only in the vocal domain has this been tested, the second order. And you mentioned that it's possible to do that also with gesture. So is there anything you'd like to say about that? Because that's something that was very interesting to me. And I wondered, for instance, whether lying is a second order or whether it's a first order, because it could be that I just want to get a behavior, but it relies on my understanding that there is different mental states between me and the recipient.
Yeah. I was actually discussing this in a journal club today because we talked about a paper on teasing in non-human primates. I can't remember the first author. I know Erica Cartmill is on that paper. And about how teasing and like that playful teasing, but also things like deception may require like this conceptualization of another's mental states, this ability to recognize another as having mental states that you may want to affect. And so we were thinking and discussing in Journal Club how we as gesture researchers and what we know about how these great apes are communicating using gestures may apply that to other behaviors such as teasing, such as deception. And it seems like quite a fruitful area of research, I think, particularly something like playful teasing, which could occur quite frequently in non-human primates.
So that would be a kind of a second order.
Yeah, it could be. So I think so some of those examples would be like there's a young chimpanzee at Bosu, and he will like hold a rock above his head. So they're doing nut cracking, and he will sort of playfully hold a rock above his head and like approach the older females until like they respond by like shooing him away, and then he like quite happily goes away.
I know humans like that.
Yeah. And so situations like that, there's potential in those scenarios that there's the potential that it's about requesting play, that was just a first order, I want you to play with me, and that the other individual has cut them off. So I think there may be ways to look at whether they just intended the other to think that they were playing. Or to think that something else was going to happen.
Yeah, it reminds me of something humans do a lot. Like, let's say that someone is here and they're doing something funny and you're looking at me, so I might do this. And we all know what that means, right? And there are even memes about that where you don't see what's happening. There's just someone just looking at like this, and that's it. And we know what this means. So I think that it does definitely make sense that animals might have these kinds of gestures too, pointing at something to make fun of the fact that somebody's not figuring something out or the like. And I don't know, I've seen all these videos of chimps laughing at some magic tricks that visitors to zoos do or things like that. So my guess is that there must be some gestural way to capture that that's not vocal.
Yeah, because part of that is that like there's an expectation that is being violated, that like I expected this to happen. Oh, this other thing happened, and that being like an interesting thing for them.
Exactly. So if they bring somebody else to it, they say, "Oh, look at this." That's complete second order then, in that sense, because it's only the mental state and it has no behavioral impact, so to speak, unless we consider laughing. All right, so we have actually a lot of questions, but usually we're doing very good on time. So we have about half an hour to just discuss, the three of us, before we go to questions. I have a lot of questions, but because I talked a lot right now, I want to wait for John and Jim to ask their questions before I start.
I have some questions. I don't know, John, what your opinion is, but I wanted to ask Kirsty a question and also hear what Melanie thinks about it, because it's related to things she talked about.
I'm having a time hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Is a little bit.
I hear you.
Okay. So can I invite Melanie on the screen? I don't know if Melanie's open to that.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Okay. I'm gonna.
Do you know Melanie Mitchell, Kirsty? So Melanie is a favorite a guest at the Salon. Was she our first guest? Like she was one of our first guests.
I think third.
Second,
I think.
third. So one of the very first sort of guests that we had, and she has written fantastic work on AI, and she has talked about GPT-3 and whatnot. So at the Salon. So I would love to see what's going on with Jovo and this question.
So yeah, so let me give you some background, Kirsty. So Melanie, when she was on, she talked about the barrier of meaning in AI, and how Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but how this is a big problem with modern AI is that we can build machines that can procedurally do stuff, but they don't obviously understand what's going on. And I was struck by your papers, Kirsty, because you talk about how the chimpanzees and the bonobos have meaning, and you talk about ways of trying to infer that they in fact do have meaning rather than just kind of are like procedural automatons, basically. So I was wondering if you could say what you think meaning is, and also how you think is a reasonable way to ascertain the extent to which they have it, and then see where that takes us.
So in the first set of papers that I shared, I think I shared one by Richard Moore that's sort of part of a back and forth between him and Tom Scott Phillips on meaning. So I think, so we're using meaning to mean the goal, the intended goal of the individual. So it's the meaning of a gesture is how the signaler intended to change the behavior of the recipient. And it's somewhat limited because, so how we sort of are, how we are looking at meaning, or how we are able to directly observe meaning. We're specifically looking at gestures that have meanings that are requests for a change in behavior. So it's not that bonobos only have gestures that mean, can you do this thing? Can you do that thing? But that we objectively don't currently know how we would pick up on something that had like a declarative meaning. So if a bonobo was like sitting and like waving up at the trees and no one responded to them, and they were communicating about like what a lovely day it was, how nice that tree was, that gesture could have meaning, but we would have no way of accessing that meaning. So for us, meaning is like the intended goal of the signaler, and we access that by looking at the change in behavior of the recipient.
So thank you. That was a clear answer. I wonder what Melanie thinks, because Melanie, in your paper, if I recall correctly, I guess if a AI agent did that, had some apparent goal, and then it was an interacting agent, and the other agent seemed to do the thing, and the first agent seemed satisfied, would you buy that the AI had now overcome the barrier of meaning? And if not, why not?
I don't think it's a all or nothing proposition. Yeah, this notion of meaning, I think it can definitely be graded. I was wondering if there's this long history of debate in psychology and now in AI about kind of association versus just kind of statistical association versus internal models. And do you have any sense about the animals that you're studying, and are they kind of just learning associations, or do they have some more rich model of the kind of theory of mind of the recipient of their gestures?
Yeah, so I'm working on a paper at the moment with Federico Rossano and Richard Moore, where we're bringing together the different theories on how gestures are acquired and understood, with the sort of putting forward the idea that these gestures may represent action schema, and that they are sort of the gesture that makes sense for that intended outcome. Because currently we have sort of two schools of thought where gestures are ontogenetically ritualized. They are ritualized exhaustively through repeated actions between like a mother and their infant, where the infant like reaches to climb onto their mother and is picked up, and through repeated interactions all the infant has to do is lift their arms up, and then the mother picks them up. So that being sort of what the like one school of thought, that all gestures are acquired through this like ritualization process, where they have to learn, and they have to learn in these dyadic interactions what the gestures are and ritualize them that way. The other being sort of like my PhD supervisor and his research group's ideas, that because of this large overlap of the gesture repertoire and gesture meanings, that there is this aspect of them that is like biologically inherited. So maybe more of a phylogenetically ritualized story, like in some bird displays. But a lot of the gestures do sort of resemble part of the actions that they achieve. And it's unlikely that they are iconic in the sense that the individual is producing them knowing that this resembles the thing that they want to achieve, and recognizing that their recipient will recognize it as such. And so sort of coming back to this idea that maybe they are using actions that are sort of naturally meaningful, and because of the body types that great apes have and the types of goals that they want to achieve, that these are the types of gestures that make sense for those goals. Sorry, that was a very long way to get to that.
So to add to that, just so I understand, so I will first ask something from you, Kirsty, and then from Melanie, because I feel like this is fantastic. We just dived into one of the most interesting things. So in chimps and bonobos, do you think that this intentionality is acquired or learned, or do you think that they're just born with it? And secondly, would the animal's experience be required to shape it? So for instance, animals socialized in one chimp group and another one in another one, would they have dialects in their gestures that they use, or is it all going to look the same? And partly I'm asking this because even in humans, there are some things that are very common, like mama or something like that is across so many languages associated with mother. And some people say because it's the way that the child might be drinking breast milk, that gesture might be the reason for the similarity across. Some people talk about it like this. Some people don't talk about it like that. And they think that no, actually vocalization then got abstract and it's not always towards the mimicking, right? So what do you think in chimps and bonobos? Do you think that, hi, Jonathan, do you think that they are born with it? Do they get cultured into it? And are there different dialects? So this is for you.
So in terms of like intentionality and deploying intentional gestures, they do so from a very young age. Probably around like 5 or 6 months, they start gesturing or producing gestures, sort of more frequently. Then they sort of go through as juveniles of like between 2 and 4 or 5 years, using a lot of gestures in a lot of sequences. And one of the hypotheses is that they're going through this like repertoire pruning process where they're using like all of the gestures available to them, and then they're figuring out which ones work. So I think in terms of, so because we have this sort of these ambiguous gestures that can like mean different things in different contexts, there are also, for like the different goals that you want to achieve, there are many gestures for achieving those. So like if you want to ask another individual to like groom you, there are many gestures that you can use to do that. And so one of the things that might come out as like community differences is the rate at which they like prefer using one of these gestures for grooming over another. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking at with our current comparison, because we think probably if you have multiple options, like there could be like cultural differences in the great apes of which ones do they prefer to use.
And bonobos have more variability or chimps? Because of the culture?
I'm not sure yet.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. And to Melanie, with regards to the question that Jova was asking, so do you think if a AI agent built a theory of mind of the recipient and started uttering certain things in order to change the belief of the recipient, would you consider that an acceptable transferring of meaning? Unintentionality?
Yes, I would. I think it's, as I said, it's kind of a matter of degree, and it has to do sort of with the complexity and the generality of the model. That, you know, in what situations can it be used? Is it just used in this one situation, or can, like, you know, it be used kind of abstracted in a way to be used across multiple situations? I don't know. One interesting thing I thought when you were talking, you know, there's been some debate, I know, in linguistics on, are all human languages equally complex? You know, that's kind of a interesting question, and we don't know exactly how to measure complexity in that sense, but I think the general consensus is yes, all languages are equally complex because they can all express the same set of concepts. You know, some of them perhaps take more, are more wordy or whatever, but you know, there's no concept that can't be translated among languages, I would guess. So here's a question, you know, you said that there's a lot of overlap between the different kinds of primates. Are all primate gesturing systems equally complex? Or is that a reasonable question?
Yeah, so we know, like, we know the most about chimpanzee and bonobo gestures, but it looks like there's also sort of, if we compare to other published like gesture repertoires, then there would be a like 80% overlap between chimpanzees and orangutans and 60% overlap between chimpanzees and gorillas. And like currently in our current project, we're starting to close that gap. So in terms of the gestures that they're using, great apes seem to be using sort of the same or a very similar set of gestures. If we go to other primates, there's growing evidence that some macaques and baboons also use a variety of gestures, although the current reported repertoires are quite a bit lower. So I think in terms of complexity, like in terms of repertoire size, it's quite similar. They do also use gestures in sequences, but we're just starting to unpick why they do that. So it doesn't seem, or at least in my bonobo data set, it didn't seem like using gestures in sequences changed the meanings of those gestures, or that gestures used in sequences or out of sequences were used for different goals. It might be something to do with emphasis. Yeah, we're not really sure what they're doing with the sequences of gestures at the moment. But yeah, currently they seem to have sort of a similar level of complexity for gestures.
So I want to push back a little on what Melanie said, because I disagree. I think even if it's continuous and it's not all or nothing, there can be phase changes. And so, you know, OpenAI has done some really cool stuff with like multi-agent gameplay where they have to cooperate and stuff like that. And to me, there's no evidence whatsoever that they have meaning. Like, they don't seem to get it. They seem to procedurally do it, and it took them, millions and millions of tries, and they eventually learned it, and it's amazing. But I don't think they have any meaning. On the other hand, I do believe that the chimpanzees and the bonobos do have meaning. I just don't think that the way that we're trying to assess whether they have meaning will work if we translate it to the AI. So I think there's something else that we have failed kind of philosophically to understand about what intentionality means or something, so that we're not quite getting at a legitimate test that we could apply to animals and AI and humans to get at this question.
Sorry, can I add a sort of a footnote to that? So Natasha, so not OpenAI, but not every kind of multi-agent cooperation, but Natasha Jacques has a particular kind of multi-agent cooperation where the agents gain sort of, it's important how they communicate information to other agents. And on the basis of how helpful this information was, the agents gain some kind of centrality. So the agent's reward is to have communicated correct information to more number of agents. And they actually started to develop some kind of a communication code or language. And now, well, not language, I don't want to call it language because I'm very hard on the criteria of language for systematicity, etc. I know some people are not, I am. So I will leave the paper there. So I just want to say not all multi-agent cooperation will be intentional, but some of them seem to be. So I think there's a difference even there. Sorry, Melanie, go ahead.
Does intentionality mean, is that the same as meaning, Jobo? I don't know. Quite sure about these terms.
I was hoping one of you would know, or maybe John has a strong opinion about it, but it seems
Well, I
like
don't have a
thought
strong
Kirsty
opinion.
was
I can
alluding-
actually tell you,
Okay,
how it's
please.
used, actually.
Please.
But, just let me know when I can actually ask a question.
I'm ready, please. But
Go
can you
for it,
actually-
John.
Yeah, say it.
Go for it, John. We are completely in shame right now. You know, if you see shame all over me.
I don't feel shame.
No,
Sorry.
look, this is actually absolutely what the Salon is about. And I think what you talked about today is really fundamentally important to everything we've discussed. And it's really been missing. I think Ida's absolutely right that we needed to have a non-human primate discussion. I think, I'm a huge H.P. Grice fan. I think that essay that he wrote on the theory of speaker meaning is incredibly profound, right? And I think, and I think it's very interesting that Ida, I think, asked the Gracian question, and I think it was right for Melanie to say yes to it, which is if, and it's been a while since I've read Grice or anything about him, but what I do remember is that he was specifically interested in meaning. And to the question, what he was particularly interested in was the intentionality of changing the beliefs or the desires of another agent. And he went through all sorts of very interesting counterexamples until he reached the situation where the recipient had to know that your intention was to change their beliefs, and they were in the position to decide whether they wanted their beliefs changed. Okay. Now, what's fascinating about that is that's philosophy of language, as I think Ida said, which then has turned into its cousin, the philosophy of mind, which is what kind of representations would you need to harbor beliefs and desires, intentionality, and then the idea then would be that language, the philosophy of language, is what Grice was interested in, is how do you transfer over different timescales beliefs and desires. Okay. The problem with AI and even in primates, I think Povinelli calls it the asymmetric dependency problem, right? Which is that because in beliefs and desires depend on perceptual object relations, but not the other way around, it can be very difficult, as you said, to get at these second order intentional states, because you have to go via the perceptual object relation states, right? And the difficulty is, and I think you pointed this out in your paper, is it's incredibly difficult experimentally to disambiguate first order perceptual object intentions from second order beliefs and desires. And so people can understand what I'm talking about. If you see an animal demonstrating that they know, and I think Povinelli gives the example of hitting harder with a stone will smash the mango more, right? But that doesn't mean that they have an abstract notion of force or gravity, right? So the big question is how do you prove that an animal has general concepts and ideas that go beyond very nice in the real world manifestations of those things, right? Now, to the point of the agents playing games, the extra step that's so interesting is that if you're doing AI and you're talking about other agents, you can turn agents into mangoes and rocks, and again do it, as Jovo said, procedurally, and they're only pseudo in possession of beliefs and desires. And that's why I asked Katja Hoffman, you know, are the agents a little bit like an earthquake? And to her credit, she said yes, basically, right? We model them the same way if they're animate or inanimate, right? So I think at the current time, you have a sort of double problem. In AI, they know what the Gricean meaning is, but they can't make it yet, so I don't get attacked by Ida, right? And then in the non-human primate kingdom, we also know the Gricean theory of speaker meaning, but it's extremely difficult to get access to it experimentally. So we've almost got the same problem we want to prove, which is this second order intentionality, you know, abstract representations of beliefs and desires, but two different problems for it. One is to create it in AI. The other one is to prove its existence in non-human primates. And it seems to me that at the current time, the answer is we don't know. We haven't definitively shown it, either in the primate world or in the AI world. Would that seem fair to you?
Could I ask, John, are you a dualist? Do you think that there's something about humans that's so special that no machine or non-human could capture?
No, I'm just saying that there's a property, which obviously I'm a materialist, we haven't been able to characterize. It's difficult. It's interesting that AI is having trouble with it, and non-human primates. And the very interesting thing is, and this gets to a sort of a deeper problem, is that intelligence can go a very, very long way before you ever have to invoke the need for second order intentionality. In other words, there's a lot of intelligent behavior in the world, right? Perceptual object relations that primates engage in are very intelligent. The question is do they have this second layer that Dennett talks about and Grace talked about before him? And I'm just saying, Ida, is that it's a thing and we're struggling with it. Will we get to it? Will we prove it in non-human primates? Will we understand it in humans? Will we reproduce it in AI? Sure. I mean, never say never, right? You're bound to end up humiliated, right? But at the moment, we don't know, is what I'm saying. And I do think that it would be better for us to say that Grice and Dennett and others are right to posit this second order, or whatever you want to call it, but we just don't quite know how to prove it, how to reproduce it, or how it's actually working mechanistically. That's just a fact empirically. And it's interesting why it's being so recalcitrant. Why is it being so recalcitrant, right? And obviously the asymmetric dependency problem that Povinelli talks about is just almost saying it's very hard not to be able to explain everything in terms of perceptual object intentionality. Very rarely do you have to invoke outside of humans this second order, right? And it's just difficult. And I think we're all struggling with it. And it's just interesting to see that the struggle comes in many forms, whether it's human neuroscience, primate behavior, or AI. And I think it makes this salon interesting.
I got to be honest, because the reason I've wondered whether you're a dualist many, many times. And, one of the most used plots in any kind of storyline is when someone says, no, I'm not interested in that person, but they actually are, even though they say, or maybe they don't even know it yet, but their behavior shows it. I feel like maybe it's a little bit like, I feel like you have been flirting with dualism for the entire.
I'm not flirting. I'm completely aware, very as well as you do, what dualism is. I'm just saying that I am genuinely, empirically, or there is something that we're all talking about. I mean, we heard a beautiful presentation today saying, can we show this extra layer? So I don't think that it's dualism. You call Grace a dualist, or Dennett a dualist, or all the people who are saying that there's this extra cognitive capacity of abstraction and second orderness that we simply haven't understood yet. It's not dualism, it's modesty.
No, wait. So I don't think that we're talking about the same thing right now. So let me maybe finish what I'm trying to say here. It's not just that you say there is something that AI is lacking, or there is something we don't know about primates. It's the resistance to ours. There could be, in principle, it's very imaginable for many of us that in principle we will figure it out in silico, and and it's just a matter of, are we going to find the right algorithm or not? Or that it could exist in some other animal, whether it looks like us, or if it's
I agree.
Let me or maybe if it's an octopus, versus the position constantly that when someone says, oh yeah, we don't have it, but here's how we think it happens, and you keep resisting that. That's something I've seen that. So that's the reason I'm asking, not just that we haven't got enough evidence currently for this or that to satisfy hard criteria, but the resistance to the possibility of it with AI. I think that's the part. And I want to hear Melanie.
I think it's important. I think it's important. I think science is a negative capability, to steal from Keats. The onus of proof is on the positive claim, not the negative claim. And all I'm saying right now is, to me, on balance, it's still much more of a mystery than a tractable problem. It may turn from being a mystery into a tractable problem, but at the moment, we're a little bit in the dark. And I think it's better to sort of recognize that than to think that there's going to be a relatively simple, and I mean relatively, Ida, extrapolation from what we're currently doing, right? And at the moment, I'm just saying that it's just much more fun to go, look, there's this other higher mountain we have to climb, and we don't have the equipment yet to climb it, but we will. If I were to have to bet and lived 1,000 years, you'd be right? But at the moment, I think we don't know what the direction is.
Yeah, I
just want to add to that.
No, go on.
Sorry, Kirsty, you say. Okay, just very quickly then. John, you point out that there's kind of two separate problems. AI has to create it, and in primatology, we have to kind of identify it. But I would say AI, maybe we've already created it, and we just don't know how to identify it yet. So AI has both problems. And that makes it harder than Kirsty's job, which is, we all kind of believe that bonobos and chimpanzees have meaning, or at least I do now based on reading her work. But I don't know how to make it really compelling to a skeptic.
Yeah, I was also going to add that, and I wonder whether this is something that you come across in AI, is that developmental psychologists get a much easier time on a lot of these concepts because we're expecting people to have them at some point. And so we're just looking for the point at which it develops. And so there's this tension between primatology and developmental psychology, where in developmental psychology, eye gaze is enough to show that you are communicating ostensively. So it's okay, well, primates also gaze at their audience while they're communicating to them. They check their attention, they modify their gestures to suit the attentional state of the recipient. And so then it's okay, well, all of this research where it's developmental psychology, infants have done this, we've used eye gaze. Okay, well, eye gaze isn't enough in non-human primates now. Is it also not enough for infants? And so what is the criteria that we're going to apply now to both human infants and non-human primates, and potentially also AI? But I think that's there's this, we're maybe at a moment in comparative psychology where we're asking things about like, what environments like that individuals are being tested in? If you're testing infants in a home environment versus chimpanzees in like a captive environment where they're interacting with something through bars. But I think that like adding into the mix that I think there's also some of these questions around when these abilities develop in humans. We also need to be very clear on those criteria, because humans get a way easier go of it in terms of like the claims that we make about our own abilities.
Although I would just say, Kirsty, to that point, you know, if you read like an amazing book like Rebecca Sacks's book, The Origin of Concepts, right, where she beautifully makes this distinction between, you know, the perception action relation, what, you know, the first level of intention, and then talking about concepts. There are lovely experiments that are done in infants where you can see a transition to what looks like second order conceptual understanding. And some of those experiments, even full grown adult chimpanzees fail them, right? So in other words, it's not as though there aren't, you know, and you look at, you know, Elizabeth Spelke and Alison Gopnik and Rebecca Sachs and all these people doing very clever experiments showing the evolution of concepts. And again, Rebecca Sachs makes a good point that there is a distinction to be made between intelligent behavior in the immediacy of objects and stimuli present at right now, and the kind of conceptual work that you can begin to show in clever experiments in infants. Again, I agree with her that there's a distinction to be made. And again, whether one will eventually be able to show it in primates, it will take ingenious experimenters like you, not armchair theorists like me, to prove it. But at least the challenge is there, right? And you know, and Jovo, I mean, I don't quite know what you mean when you say you think they already have it. I mean, it's very difficult to ever find out whether a bonobo has a general concept of gravity based on the behavior you watch. It's difficult, right? It's not an easy experiment to perform.
I agree. It's based on faith more than evidence. It just seems like it to me, and it seems like the AI does not. And I'm, you know, that's where I'm standing now. I'm willing to adjust my belief on the basis of stronger evidence one way or the other in either case.
There's something interesting about Kirsty's talk of that this notion of meaning only can happen in a social context. You know, everything is about social interactions, which is something that I would say we don't have at all in AI. In spite of like multi-agent game playing, et cetera, we don't have any machines that interact socially in the sense that they have kind of a rich enough theory of the thing that they're communicating with, the other agent that they're communicating with. And that seems to be part of the magic. And probably the reason we have our big brains, right, is because it's for social, because we live in a social world and we have to model other members of our species. So that seems to be really important for this meaning question. So that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you. I don't want to jump to the end of the beginning of the line since there's 22 questions out there, but I just wonder, is like, does meaning make any sense if it's not in a social context?
I don't like most definitions of meaning do have that social element. So it is about, well, when it's about mental states, it's always about other individuals in terms of changing. Yeah, so for communication, yeah, I would say that meaning is always, meaning and communication for what we're talking about in non-human primates is definitely always social.
Does it count as social? Oh, sorry, I
just wanted to say very quick. I practice a lot of antisocial meetings just on my own. Just think about meetings without talking to anyone about it. I'm sure all of us do.
I was going to say something similar. Like, what if I'm communicating with my future self? Like, I write down a note for me later. That's kind of an antisocial. But I feel like there's meaning there.
Yeah. Also,
except that maybe. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I just don't think you could come up with that idea or that concept if you hadn't been born and raised in a social environment.
Yeah, that goes again to the Wittgensteinian maybe idea of language as tool use, where you need to be in a situation where you are giving and taking reasons. So it goes a little bit back also to Robert Brandon, maybe articulating reasons and making it explicit, his books, which is again somewhat in the Wittgensteinian tradition to some extent, but Wittgenstein too, not one. The idea that give and take of reasons, or this game of giving and taking reasons, is similar to tool use, and that's the required aspect of language. And that goes to the very idea that we couldn't have a private language, because in principle it's teachable. Although maybe I didn't tell you, if I explained it to you, or if you observe my behavior and how I'm using it, you could figure out in principle. So I see what you're saying, Melanie, that in principle it requires some social life in order for it to exist.
John, are you satisfied with your questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Jonathan should get to. I look. I think this is fantastic. I think it's really. Each time you think you've had the best salon, you get another one that's even better. I think this is really wonderful. But I think in a way that I hope that we can write something about that we're going to get to this answer through plurality. You know, investigation of humans of the kind that Ida and I like to do, trying to get at through AI. Philosophy of mind, very nice empirical work in non-human primates. I think it's going to be one of those situations where we're going to have to find a way to get convergence on these questions. And I think it's very inspiring to me anyway.
And are we going to use rats and insects too, John?
Of course.
There I part
no rat meanings.
What does Kirsty think? She stares at animals, non-human animals, more than the rest of us. Do you think rats have meaning? We're going to need to look at them?
Well, there's like growing evidence of intentional communication across other species. So I think it's like the more, I don't know if you've heard of the Many Primates Project, which is a big collaborative project where like people at different zoos or sanctuaries, like each researcher will do a little experiment and then all bring that together. I think something like that could test a wider number of species would be incredible to sort of, to get an idea of how robust our criteria for intentionality are, whether there are some things that we haven't considered in how sort of other species might communicate. I think that would be super exciting.
And I just want to advertise again Kirsty's amazing the review paper that she had in Philosophical Transactions of Royal Society, because she does mention fish, she does mention fireflies. So it's not just, forget about rats. Rats are way above, like they're mammals. So, yeah.
Cool. Dr. Flowers, you have a question?
Less of a question and more of a general observation, right? So I take it to be the case that we can't really talk about gestures outside of a broader social or cultural context, right? And insofar as we're interpreting gestures as such, we are doing so not from an objective standard, but from a standard that has emerged historically and socially. And so to ask the question of whether or not a non-human primate has intentionality, especially if we read intentionality backwards from gesture or from the second order kind of mental states as indicated by gestures, is to ask if, in my view, is to ask if a a non-human primate has human intentionality or human-like gestures rather than say gestures local to their own cultural and social context, which is where I take the idea of having three separate ways of assessing gestures a little bit further, right? You'd have to assess, say, primates within their local context and AI within its local context. And I generally agree that we can't do anything with AI and meaning until AI learns to be sociable. But that's an aside. And so we'd have to think about these things within their local context and the functions that the gesture has. Because, I mean, if I'm going to be real Deweyan about this, our gestures proceed from what he calls impulsions, right? The child's outreaching to be picked up or they're crying when they're hungry secures some response from their environment, including the people in it. And thus the child learns that action A will result in response B and starts laying the groundwork for our broader systems of communication where action can be coordinated to some end. And then in larger social contexts, more actions collectively can be associated or can be coordinated to broader ends, and hence we get human communication or human language as kind of a development out of this. But this is not to say other organisms don't do this, right? And this is not to say that other organisms thus don't have modes of articulating meaning. The question is, do we want human meaning? Do we want to understand these things from within the context of our human experience, or do we want to understand these things within the context of the given organism's experience? Which gets to this entire thing in the chat about gravity, right? A bonobo will understand gravity insofar as it uses a tool to knock a piece of fruit from a tree and that fruit falls, right? It has the experience of the object falling, or it has an experience of falling when it fails to coordinate its actions when moving among branches. The bonobo does not understand gravity as a relationship of mass, right? It doesn't understand gravity in the broader sense that humans do, but it does understand gravity as it functions within its ongoing lived experience, right? So what we're calling gravity is a human articulation of a given experience, which might be common across entities, but the meaning, its total effect in the broad experience of entities is vastly different. My understanding of gravity is not my cat's understanding of gravity, and definitely would not be a crow's understanding of gravity, given the organizations of their bodies. So that's generally my broad concern with the entire gesture intentionality discussion.
Yeah, I would also like put a big vote in for asking what is meaningful for the organism. I completely agree with that point, because so I alluded to it briefly in our talk, but the way that gestures have been categorized before is kind of just like, what do we think they look like? So like, does this look like a separate gesture than this? So if the researcher is like, well, this is an arm raise and this is an arm raise, that's how it's been categorized. And what we're starting to do now is to try to describe the form of the gesture in as detailed a way as possible, and then ask what is meaningful to the bonobo. So is there a meaningful difference to the bonobo between this and this? Because yeah, I think there are obviously very interesting questions around the evolution of language and cognition, and studying non-human primates as a view into that. But I think that studying their communication to understand what is meaningful to them, and what are the things that they need to communicate about, because that is the context in which their evolution has evolved. These are the things they need to communicate about. This is what's good enough for them. This is, yeah. So yeah, no, I really like that point.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the core of the issue. What does a bonobo need to gesture about, and what does a human need to gesture about? And while there might be some overlap there, right, given the different kinds of experiences that both bonobos and humans have, while we might have similar kind of gestures, we could only talk about the meanings of these things in kind of general senses, which raises the point of, say, the kinds of gestures that a dog or a cat might use when communicating or engaging in interaction with a human versus with other dogs or cats, right? There's broad evidence that say cats meow specifically in specific ways at humans, but not at other cats, which I think, far be it for me to say that cats have gestures, which I generally think they do, which seems to indicate a distinction in the kinds of, or an open space in the kinds of research that needs to be done. It's not simply in group now, but it's communications across groups, which has implications for language. And I forget who said that, or who among us said that human languages generally communicate the same things. And I'm not entirely sure they might do so in generalities, but there are particular quirks of human languages that come as a result of human cultures as creative responses to environments, right? So English, we don't have a word for the light filtering through the leaves of a tree. In Japanese, we have komorebi, which is a single word to express that phenomena. So I think languages, we also need to, I want to say, import the creative element, right, of languages into our understanding of gestures and things like that, insofar as languages, like the cultures from which they emerge, are also creative responses to the environment for the coordination of some action. And so we then need to think about what kinds of actions are necessary for what organisms to coordinate in what ways, which, gets us to Jovo's question about, and Melanie's question about the sociability of AI, insofar as they only need to be sociable to win chess, but they don't need to be sociable to do other things because that's outside of the given parameters.
Mm-hmm. I think that also connects nicely with like the ontogeny of gestures. So we do see like human infants using some of the great ape gestures, like the gestures that we see in other great apes. And like the social needs of human infants are not that dissimilar to other great apes. They need to be picked up and carried. They need to be fed. They need like someone to pay attention to them. And so those sort of similarities in early gesture could also be sort of an artifact of this, like these shared social needs. Which I think is quite interesting. And then, so obviously, as we grow up, those our social worlds diverge so quickly that then we're hardly using any of the overlapping gestures.
I mean, and then we get to the ethical question, right? Whose judgment of gesture and communication are we using, right? What cultural ground are we standing upon when we judge some things as meaningful gestures and other things as not? Which, again, if we're going to bring this to AI, right, whose cultural standard are we using to judge the say interpretability and meaning making capacity of an AI, at least in human computer interaction?
I think I see John's Wi-Fi symbol.
I think I can hear him typing.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the part of the evening where John's Wi-Fi drops out.
I thought I'd invite him.
Okay, let's hope that he can join us.
Okay.
So that was a very interesting discussion you guys had. So before you guys leave the screen, I just want to ask one last time from each of you. So what would convince you that there is meaning in James Bonobos and AI if you're not convinced of it?
If someone found a mechanism to properly articulate the social context of chimps and AI, right? So I don't think AI as we currently have it can construct meaning given the limitations on the ways it transacts with the environment. So that's my position, full stop. I'm not discounting the possibility that we can't create an AI that has the capacity to do this, but at current, we don't have it. And when we get there, I would not want to, I'd be real interested in whether or not the meanings are even intelligible to us, given the radically different embodiments of the technology. So that's just for AI. But bonobos, I generally think that I think we'd have to study the ways that they are in transaction with one another and with their environment, not in captivity, mind you, because that would change the kinds of meanings that are necessary. And then we could start talking about the meaningful nature of their gestures. But broadly, it doesn't take much to convince me that bonobos and other non-human organisms have meaningful gestures. The question is the nature of the meaning within the context in which they're used, and how that can be translated to other contexts. So I don't need to be convinced.
So for AI, you needed cultural context of AI.
Yeah, a social context or something like you. And realistically, I think, if we ever solve this problem, right, with AI being able to socialize with other AI towards a multitude of goals, right, not specifically the one goal like winning chess, you start resolving all kinds of other problems with AI, like how to get a self-driving car to coordinate navigation with other self-driving vehicles, so on and so forth. These are social problems that are limited that are structured by the hard limits of the technology we have at current. But so this, I think, is a technical problem that I'm unsure how to resolve. But once we get past that technical hurdle, I think we'd see an explosion of a variety of ways that AIs make meaning. The question then would be whether or not we'd understand it.
Yeah, I appreciate the sort of ecumenical leveling that you're doing, Jonathan, and that everyone has their own meaning, and meaning is in the eye of the cultural beholder, and cats have their meaning, and dogs have theirs, and bonobos have theirs. Obviously, on one level, if we're talking about first order intentionality of the perceptual object kind, sure. But this kind of denialism of there being this extra thing that allows us to have these long Zoom calls every week, and that this is not something different, is just bizarre to me, right? And if I were to say, look, I'm actually a little bit of a fish myself, I can't breathe underwater and I drown within 2 minutes, but for those 2 minutes, I'm a little bit of a fish, right? It's just a very strange way of arguing, it seems to me. I'm just saying that there are things that we're all struggling with, whether it's common sense in AI, whether it's linguistic meaning, concepts like Carey talks about, and to simply say, well, it's all just situational and contextual, and what you currently need is just to sweep away the philosophical and scientific problem, right? It's actually, that fantastic paper that Kirsty wrote in Philosophical Transactions, going from the Gracian and Dennett view, was because is there proof of that kind of second order mental state or not, right? In other words, if it's all just context and everyone has their own meaning, then we don't have to write papers like that one, right? We don't have to worry about that philosophical scientific boundary that Kirsty wrote about so nicely in that paper. So in a way, it's sweeping away the problem by being, in a sense, admirably fair, but it gets rid of very important distinctions, which is what science is all about.
John, I just want to let you know that while you were saying that in the chat, I asked whether others think that's what John Flowers said. And I think many of us don't think that's what John Flowers said. So I'm going to give time to Jonathan to just explain what he actually said.
Yeah, that's actually not what I said. And if you want a more scientifically oriented kind of articulation of the position that I'm taking here, if you look at Mark Johnson's work on bodily concepts and conceptual metaphor, how they proceed from the ways that the human body is organized in particular ways and engages with the world, that might kind of avoid some of these problems or these things that you're looking at. I'm not saying that we can sweep away the scientific problem. Indeed, the science is necessary to point to the very real material conditions that give rise to the bodies that are making meaning and how these bodies transact with the environment, right? And this is why we need to look at, say, neuroscience and evolutionary biology and other kinds of physical sciences that point to why we have bodies like ours that enable us to do X, Y, and Z. And when we start looking at it from that perspective, we can see the ways in which meaning, as continuous with the kinds of organisms we are, must be different, must necessarily be different for the organisms that we are. Now, this is not to say that there aren't commonalities and generalities in the ways that organisms engage with environments to maintain their characteristic patterns of action, which we call life. But the question is, if we want to communicate, if we want to coordinate with other organisms towards some defined action, how do we interpret these things across contexts, right? And so my argument here is, even if we take up the scientific evidence that talks about how we are organisms like ourselves and in transaction with the environment, we need to look at the science as telling us something about what other organisms are doing, and not attempting to say, bring the organism into our own context and understand it from our position, right? So a meaning, I'd say a meaning should be understood locally and then generally, right? To see where these things overlap, right? Because if you don't understand the local meaning of what a bonobo is doing, how do we meet somewhere in the middle, right? You can't simply drag an entity's meaning into your own context and say, bam, I understand it. So yeah, so I'm not sweeping away the science. I'm saying the science gives us very good reason to think about these things locally, and then try to think about the intersections of them as making clear generalities in how organisms reasonably organized like ourselves make meaning.
Maybe we also hear from Melanie. Thank you, Jonathan, for that.
Yeah.
About what would convince you, Melanie, that AI or a chimp have meaning?
Right. So I agree with a lot of what Jonathan just said, and I've also been very influenced by people like Mark Johnson and George Lakoff and so on. And I do think that meaning is some kind of correspondence between our mental models or simulations and the physical world, which is very embodied, which very much is influenced by the kind of bodies that we have and what we do with them. And I think, so I'm not answering your question yet, but I will. Why is, you were talking about, do chimps or bonobos have a general concept of gravity? I'm not exactly sure what a general concept of gravity means. They certainly have some concept of gravity. They can predict what's going to happen if they drop something. They don't. I think we humans have some mechanism that we don't understand very well for making concepts more general and more abstract. We can talk about gravity as a physical force, but I could also say, there's a strong gravitational pull between me and this other person, meaning that, we really are attracted to each other or something like that. We can make these metaphorical extensions of concepts that are based on these physical concepts that the kind of Mark Johnson, like physical basic core knowledge, right, that we have of the physical world. And I'm not sure that whether chimps or bonobos are able to do that kind of metaphorical abstraction or not, but I see that as a key part of what makes up meaning for us, at least. What would make me think that a chimp or a bonobo has some kind of intentionality or meaning? I already think that, mostly because I think our brains are just so similar. And so it's an analogy. I think that how could they not, given the kinds of similarity that the behavioral similarity they have to us. And, if we think we ourselves have this quality, by analogy, I think these other animals that are so genetically and behaviorally related to us do. For an AI system, it's much harder because it's just such a different kind of thing. And I don't, if I can't look under the hood of the system and kind of look at what kinds of models it has and really understand the mechanisms by which it's acting, it's hard for me to give it that, to kind of allow it that kind of intentional agency. And then I just have to rely on behavioral impressions that come from, like a kind of Turing test. I don't know any other way, but I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks.
I just want to add one thing. So the problem with Turing tests is that humans are the judges. And so if we made Turing tests that an octopus was the judge or a chimp was the judge, if a robot is actually a robot or it's a chimp, you know what I mean? So that would maybe be the test. But one thing I wanted to say, and again, this book and Metazoa, I'm like, I keep rereading certain chapters of them almost like obsessively, like a kind of a ritual. Every now and then I walk in the park and then sit somewhere and reread the chapter 2. I want to mention this wonderful documentary, My Octopus Teacher, that is on Netflix, actually. Not that we're promoting big corporations. There is something about the fact that the documentary filmmaker has been making documentaries before, and in the beginning of the documentary film, he expresses this need to be in the nature as opposed to outside of it and observing it. And he had gone to Africa and he had observed people he had filmed people who track animals, and he was envious of them because they had a relationship with the natural world that he didn't have. So he tries to have that relationship by the ocean. So he spends hundreds of days swimming to the same location, observing the same paths and creating a map of it in his home and observe. And then he says, for instance, he drops the wetsuit because he thinks that his skin has to be available to feel more embodied in that environment. He starts to, at some point, he loses the octopus and he starts thinking, I have to think like an octopus. So he starts to adopt that mental state. Very much like the proper way maybe an anthropologist should be looking at another culture as opposed to looking at it from the perspective of one culture to another. And I really appreciated that transformation that happened in the documentary. So that's what I wanted to say, Melanie. When we want to infer perhaps mental states or such in other species, or even in other cultures, because there was a time where Europeans thought, for instance, people in other cultures didn't have a mind. And so whether it's other cultures or whether it's other species, I think it might be important to adopt that perspective somehow or simulate it. For me, maybe with a computer sort of simulation, for someone maybe trying to adopt the perspective of that animal somehow. For somebody else like the octopus teacher, really trying to swim there and feel that and try to have skin-to-skin interaction with the octopus to feel that kind of bond and try to think like it by swimming there every day for hundreds of days, which is a very long time to do that. Like, I don't know, just a thought on what you were saying, that sometimes maybe Turing tests, while I use it myself, but for human-like behavior, maybe the judges shouldn't be humans if you want to have a Turing test for octopus communication or for,
Look,
does that make sense?
I'm all for that. Those books are great, and I'm all for Umwelt love. And one should get down into the Umwelt of other animals. I think it makes for better documentaries. But I'm very, if I may say, Melanie, a bit shocked and disappointment by your argument that they must have it by analogy. I mean, dogs don't see red. They lack the receptor. They have only 2 receptors versus 3. So they categorically don't have red. They don't have a little bit of it. They see in blue and yellow. So in other words, to go, well, they're animals like us, so they probably do see red. That's how your argument sounds to me, right? They don't see red at all. But you're just saying, well, they're not that different. They're animals. So they probably do see a little bit of red. I mean, that's not an argument.
I'm not saying that, John. I mean, if I saw, if I knew nothing about bonobos' reproduction, I would still guess that they reproduce sexually because they're similar to us in that way. I would guess that they breastfeed their babies, and I just feel like there's certain things that are evolutionarily, there's a strong prior probability for it. And
like having
there's
3 color receptors instead of 2.
No, I don't have that prior. And I think that dogs have a very different, they have a very different conceptual structure than we do because they rely so much on olfactory sense. And I don't know if chimps or bonobos have intentionality. all I can do is look at their behavior and my prior probabilities.
Sure, but
And
as
so
Kirsty's shown us, you have to be really, really, you can't just do that. You have to go out in the field, just like Ida said. You have to come up with very clever experiments and notions to really test this. One can't just generally throw out the idea that, oh, I think. I mean, you have to go out there and really look and do these very hard experiments before one just...
No, I'm not saying I agree with you. I'm not saying that you don't have to do that, but her experiments have kind of fit with my my confirmation bias, since I already believed it. But you could also, you could imagine building a robot that does all these same gestures. We've seen all the robots that do parkour and other kinds of crazy things. And yet I know I'm much less likely to think that they have intentionality, just because they're not animals and they're not so evolutionary related to us. But I take your point.
All right, let's see if we have other people. I think Conrad and maybe, I don't know if Natasha's still here, but thank you so much, Melanie and Jonathan Flowers. One thing I'll say while I'm inviting the other people is, to me, it feels like there's something fundamentally missing. Like, we talk about gravity, whether we understand gravity, but like, I think no one understood gravity until Newton. And in order for Newton to understand it, he needed to know like arithmetic, because there's an equation that we use to describe it. To me, we're not even at the point where we have like the conceptual repertoire, which would be arithmetic, so to speak, such that we can explain whether or not we have meaning. Like there's concepts missing such that we have no hope to explain it until we get something else first.
And also, just on that gravity thing again, it's that interesting thing before the math comes along where you go, maybe the small objects on Earth and the big objects up in space are subject to the same principle. It's that very strange moment of generalization and extrapolation where you can say, maybe these things all look different in my immediate experience. None of us have been up in space, I don't think. But nevertheless, one can go, it's conceivable that the same force is operating at these massive differences in scale. That kind of abstraction is a very different beast to knowing how to smash a mango with a rock.
Smashing a mango with a rock would be a terrible idea if you've eaten mangoes. I mean, there's a generalization between smashing a nut open and using a heavier stone to hit a rival. And those are the kinds of transformations I think that monkeys do make. Or, the other way around, going from knowing that a heavier stone hurts a rival more to making the transformation where a nut, to knowing that it'll break a nut more easily. And these are things, again, that monkeys can do, apes, can do. I think Farghese has shown that monkeys can do it as well. So I don't know, I feel like, I think it's possible to be skeptical about what physics and what inferences animals can and cannot make. But I think it's also possible, where John's going right now, is to go too far in that, is to say that it's impossible that they can do that.
I've never said it's impossible. I'm saying it's difficult to demonstrate. I think it's really interesting that when one takes a different position, it's ethically interpreted. I would love all the bonobos and the chimpanzees to actually be more abstract and more intentional than us. I have no axe to grind. I am an atheist. I do not believe that humans occupy any special place. But I'm saying that there is a tendency to be able to do abstraction of the kind that we're now discussing that is a weird thing, right? And I'm saying that it's got this extra ability to generalize and extrapolate that is interesting. Now, whether it's a continuum or not is what everyone's trying to do experimentally. We're scientists, ultimately, right? We have to try and prove things. We can't just believe things or hope for things, right? And I'm just saying at the moment, there's a discontinuity. There's a phase shift, as we heard from Jovo. And I'd like to know what that non-linear transition, that emergent thing is. That's all. I have no axe to grind. I hate humans, right?
You love a special subset of us, John.
But we love you, John. It's okay if you hate us. We love you.
No, he loves us.
That's different. You're right. You guys are exceptions.
It's true. I'm an alien according to my green card, so.
But I think that something like tool use in non-human primates is interesting, both in terms of like their concepts of physics and sort of their understanding of like the qualities so chimpanzees in West Africa use stone tools to crack nuts, and they have an anvil stone and a hammer stone, so that the stone that you lay the nut on shouldn't be too curved or the nut will just roll off. And sort of through experience, they learn which tools are suitable. They have preferred tools. They will carry a nicely shaped stone to the nut cracking site. So I think there's some tool use offers like a really neat insight into like their understanding of the properties of objects for like what they need, whether that's termite fishing. There's chimps in Gualugo have a set of stick tools that they use. They'll use a heavier stick to puncture the ground to get at underground termites, and then narrower sticks, and they'll chew them to get bristled ends to dip in and feed the termites. So, and extract the termites. Also sort of around like cognition and around planning as well. So being able to plan that you're taking these toolkits to the place where you know the food source is. Yeah, I've been trying to keep up with the chat, and I saw that tool use popped in there. And I think, yeah, in terms of like, yeah, Natasha, your example of like their understanding of the properties of objects, that's a really a useful way of looking at it.
Natasha, you brought up something else in the chat that maybe you could ask again. You added a nice reference as well to this paper, Folk Physics for Apes, that I think Kirsty mentioned earlier too, by Povinelli.
I mean, I didn't necessarily have a lot more to add than the idea that, well, before we had physics in the way we have physics now, we had a folk physics. We had sort of an embodied understanding of how things worked, and we worked our way up from there to representations that are more mathematical. So, and I agree with John that by and large, most animals are kind of stuck at the stage that we know of, are stuck at the stage where their physics is folky. They understand the properties of objects, and they understand them only in as much as they can manipulate them and do things with them. So there is a difference, but there's no reason not to think that they don't have physical concepts. There are some animals that we think do have physical concepts. I also think that there are tools that show that you can make tools and make very good tools and even make better tools without a physical concept. So there are ways to do it without so I study tree crickets and how they make baffles, which are acoustic tools, and they can make optimal acoustic tools, but I don't think they know anything about acoustics. They just kind of have inherited a fixed algorithm that lets them do that. So I think it's possible to do this thing between skepticism, where you really think about a particular behavior and whether it requires the kind of inference. And I think people that have worked on tools in apes and primates have a lot of that. I don't know if I'm carrying on too much. One more thing I do want to say about the whole phase transition thing that John brought up there is, like, yes, I think humans are very different, and sort of the level of things we do is really different. But one thing that's worth not forgetting, and this is something a primatologist could speak to better, is that it was a close on a few 100,000 years before we got there. So humans made axes, for instance, tools in which they had to understand certain specific properties of physics for lots of years, and they did absolutely nothing to those axes for hundreds of thousands of years. And they were just stuck there. And then we have no reason to believe that we're genetically or brain-wise different from those humans at all. None whatsoever. So what happened? That transition isn't in our brain. That transition isn't in our genes. We're looking for it in the wrong place, perhaps. That's kind of the sum of what I want to say.
I wish I could answer that question. Yeah. It's just like, it's really, it feels so disappointing that like you're just trying to imagine what things were like. And I guess that's one of the nice things about like comparative research is looking at different species in which like evolution could have been convergent. We're looking at species who have like shared a long evolutionary history with us, but also looking at a species that have similar social structures or similar ecological needs and that kind of thing. But yeah, that sort of that switch. I also think this is like something that's always in the back of my mind is the interesting like puzzle of thinking about how we would think if we were not a linguistic species. Like, what is thinking even like if we're not if you're not linguistic? What is it? How does it feel? And I think that is I don't know, that's always in the back of my mind with when we're thinking of how other species communicate and we're trying to put it into words.
Conrad?
Well, Ev Fedorenko at MIT has written a beautiful paper, which I always recommend, where she looked at the cognitive abilities that were preserved in global aphasics. And without exception, all the human cognitive abilities were preserved. So they were thinking perfectly fine without language.
Yeah, and there must be a literature. That's what I was going to ask, where people compare how the verbal ability of people, which undoubtedly varies, how that seems to relate to like the ability to generalize.
And also the work on mathematical ability and verbal ability, they dissociate, even though they're parietal. And also tool use in apraxia, which is lost, is not related to the degree of language loss. So in other words, tool use, imitation are not related to language. Arithmetical ability is not related to language. So there are lots of cognitive abilities that do not require language. Now, whether you need language early on in school to help you learn non-linguistic skills as sort of an instructional scaffold is another question. But there's certainly a lot of cognitive abilities, and Ev's work is wonderful. I mean, we should have her on, actually, where she's actually shown this.
I think it's different if you're talking about intersubject variability in humans and correspondence with generalization, which is a lot of the times dependent on learning and one's history, etc., versus across species. Because when we're talking across species, the question is there any instance in that species where the mother is teaching the child? And from all of the David Attenborough documentaries I've been watching during the pandemic, I can tell with certainty that moms teach some tool use to their kids in the animal world. I've seen it so many times, so I'm pretty sure of that. And there comes John's typing. We were waiting for it. And so I think there's a difference there, Conrad, between within a species, given your background, your upbringing, what you were taught, what you ate, how much milk you had when you were a kid, etc., as opposed to across species. What's the potential across species? What is already done in the wild, what is practiced in the wild, and what the animal can learn in the lab? I think those are different. I think when we talk about humans, intersubject variability is a little bit like if we had a human in the lab under the best conditions, what's the maximum it could achieve? I don't think that's perhaps telling as looking at the different species of generalization across species.
And maybe this is a good time to plug my question that I put there in there a while ago, which is like, I'm just curious about the empirical data. You know, like how much gesturing is there beyond apes? Like if I see my cat, it totally feels like it's gesturing at me. You know, like it indicates that it's hungry. It indicates all kinds of things. So I'm curious how the literature looks like there. And I apologize if it's a somewhat naive question. It's just for me to think through it. It would just help a lot to like understand that a little deeper.
Yeah, unfortunately, cats aren't as well studied as dogs. So in terms of gestures, and I think also sort of dogs are an interesting model species in terms of like how they have been domesticated and like what we have selected for. And so like dog comprehension of pointing is quite remarkable. And so there is some sort of gesture comprehension, at least, and some gesture use in dogs, but sort of general gesture research is focused mainly on primates. There's some research on corvids. And there's sort of, in the way that there's research on birdsong and then there's research on specific call types, where like now more bird researchers, where there has been a focus on displays, we're now looking at sort of individual gesture actions. So I think potentially we'll start to see more like gesture use in birds.
I'm not that great with this literature, but isn't there some evidence that cats only meow because they want to manipulate us into giving them food? They don't do it when they communicate with each other?
Yeah. Meowing seems to be a human directed.
I have seen cats pairing meowing, but like in a different way, a little bit more intense. So it sounds different, but they do definitely use vocalizations with each other. We had a lot of, so Tehran was filled with street cats growing up. So I've seen a lot of cats in the wild because they basically own the city and we live there with their permission and give them food. So I've seen a lot of cats in the wild, just in a quiet alley, just like staring at each other and meowing very loudly, just different from the kind of cute meow that they use with humans. So I do think that the meow with humans is that. Another thing is a cat that I had the pleasure of living with had learned in the morning, it would go and she would go and open and close the drawers, and this sound would wake me up. I was the person who would wake up earlier than others. So I would come outside. She would just wrap herself around my feet until I moved towards the kitchen and went and gave her food, basically. So it was way above meowing. It was a very complex, multi-step, goal-directed behavior, which included her learning that opening and closing the door has the effect of me waking up. So I don't know. I kind of believe in cats. I'm not claiming they have meaning, but this behavior was very clear, instrumental, hierarchical, multi-step. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question around domestication and how it has shaped cognition is also really interesting. We have guinea pigs, which like guinea pigs have been domesticated for 7,000 years. And they make a like wee like really loud sound, but they only like the sort of the wild non-domesticated type don't make this call. Like it seems to be most similar to their alarm call, but it's only made in like feeding contexts with humans. So it seems to be like that in domesticating a species, we select for individuals who communicate to us, individuals who are friendlier to us, individuals who are more tolerant of us. And so like there's a whole suite of behaviors and of like physical characteristics that come along that. It is 11 p.m. here. So could I take a couple more questions and then maybe go to sleep?
Of course, of course.
Kirsty, you can go to
It's
sleep.
completely up to you.
How reasonable of you, Kirsty. How dare you be so reasonable?
So maybe we can have Nidhi. Nidhi already mentioned that they'd be happy to join the screen, especially if Natasha and Conrad, you guys, whoever volunteers to give their hi. So yeah, maybe Nidhi can join, and then we can have that question. And I will just ask the question Hugo Spears asked on screen. Must all meaning be goal-directed?
Yes, but the goal need not be a change in behavior. Like as John has said, like the goal can be a change in mental state or affecting the mental state of another individual. So we use goal directed to mean that it is aiming to influence another individual or to change something about another individual, be that their behavior or their mental state. So yeah, I think what is sometimes misleading is that we look for changes in behavior. And so not all meanings may lead to a direct, like observable change in behavior, but those are the ones that we're able to pick up on.
Maybe for our last question, before we let you go to sleep.
Nidhi? Can you unmute?
Nidhi, can you hear us? Oh no, you can't
I
hear.
unmuted her, but I don't think she can hear us.
Can you speak just okay? Can you speak so we see if we can hear you?
Can you hear me maybe I'll
Now
just
we
ask
can.
my
Yes.
question and leave because I can't hear you.
Okay.
So one way that I know that someone is trying to gain meaning from when I'm trying to communicate something is when they either look confused or ask for a clarification or nod in agreement in some way. So do you see any of this? Like, do you ever see expressions of confusion or requests for clarification in these apes? And then do you see in response the other ape repeating themselves or sort of doing the same thing again to sort of make it clear what they were trying to say?
Can you hear me now, or did you want? I'm not sure if you wanted to leave so that I can answer afterwards.
I think you can answer. Maybe
Maybe she
I
has
was
to
just-
leave. I think Kirsty might be right that she might have to leave in order to be able to hear the answer.
All right. I will. Nidhi, I'm kicking you out so you can hear the answer. I'm sorry.
All right. Can you hear me speaking now to answer your question?
There is a gap, so she will hear it, but with a little delay, a couple of seconds delay.
So I think this is also, well, so not all gestures that we see like achieve a successful outcome. So they don't all elicit a change in behavior. And this might be because individuals like don't want to do what they're being asked to do. It might be because it's a gesture that doesn't require a change in behavior. But there is also, so like as you alluded to, if individuals are understanding something, there is the potential for them to misunderstand something. And I think this is potentially one of the ways in which we can try to gain insight into like the cognitive underpinnings of meaning if we can figure out how to distinguish between a gesture that doesn't receive an outcome because it doesn't need a response, doesn't the individual just doesn't want to respond, or whether the individual misunderstands and needs clarification. So I think, yeah, that sort of, I'm not sure how we would observe that or how we would test that, but that if we really want to look at individuals understanding things, then considering how gestures could be misunderstood and whether gestures are misunderstood. It's sort of like Tom Scott Phillips made a suggestion that for like overt ostensive communication, one of the proofs of that would be whether individuals could do covert ostensive communication. So it's almost looking at whether individuals understand something by also asking whether they can misunderstand things. So I think that's really interesting, and I'd like to look more into it. And if anyone has any ideas about how to interpret those gesture types that aren't successful, or the gesture instances rather, I'd be really interested.
So one interesting way to do it perhaps would be if the same chimp or bonobo does the same gesture with different others, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. So the intention can be inferred based on how statistically they use this. And there will be some situations where that intention doesn't seem to have the same effect on some others. I'm pretty sure that happens. I mean, it happens with humans, right? So I think that kind of statistical analysis might help. And that would be very helpful. It's something that I was thinking in the beginning when you were showing your methods. If you have if you team up, I don't know, either with some company or with some group or team who would sort of large scale analyze the videos for various aspects, because it seems like there's so much valuable information that might be missed if it's only human coders. First of all, it's a lot of work for a human coder. I can imagine that you must have punched over the videos for hours just entering the sort of the codes. And these kinds of things, statistical questions, it becomes much easier to ask if an AI is analyzing your hundreds of hours of footage, and you're saying, all right, this is chimp A, and how often does he use this gesture, and how often is it successful or not? There could be very cool methods and applications. I really like this. Are there any people who model chimp bonobo behavior? The computational models of their behavior?
Yeah, Dan Schofield has done some modeling, tracking individuals who are using tools at BOSU, and is probably, like, their research group is the closest to like modeling behavior in the wild. We have a student in our group, Charlotte Wiltshire, who's working using Deep Lab Cut to try to, she's done it for lip smacking. And created a model for lip smacking based on, I think it's Claire Witham's models for macaques. So we're getting there. But yeah, there's a whole load of challenges around that.
I've never done any primatology behavioral modeling, but we have a paper from 2014 where we took things that would be like the output of Deep Lab Cut and tried to learn clusters of behaviors. This happened to be in larval Drosophila, but kind of in an unbiased, non-human centric identification of kind of reliable differences in clusters. And that, was fun and complicated. And we had like, whatever, tens of millions of behaviors. And I would love to be able to do that on something that wasn't a larval Drosophila also.
Yes. Well, let's talk.
Great.
The other thing I was thinking about cognitive models. So the way that we model, we build let's say reinforcement learning or a cognitive model of human behavior or rodent behavior or fly behavior. So that's also something that I had in mind, because if there is a paper like that, I'd love to see. And that's the kind of thing that would be fun to see, especially because we have, for instance, reinforcement learning models for monkey, for bat, for fly, for rodent, for human, under sometimes similar tasks. So some tasks that were in humans were adopted for rodents. Some tasks in humans were adopted for monkeys. So there is comparative work with those cognitive models. I would love to see how it compares with our closer evolutionary cousins, because macaques are very far compared to, let's say, bonobos and chimps. Do you know of any?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'll have a look. But no, yeah, I think that would be interesting.
We have exhausted you.
Yeah, I think
Thank you
Kirsty
so
has
much
shown
for
enormous,
bearing.
enormous resilience and
Yeah.
really, but actually just vital addition. So
Absolutely vital. And to our benefit of that to us, we've had guests from the UK which we held for another hour after this time. So like we're this time like letting you go.
Thank you. I'm gonna go have a whiskey and then go to bed.
That's usually the classic reaction to the post-salon treatment. So thank you so much. This has been fantastic. It's been one of the, I think, most deep sort of salons that we've had. And every time we say this, and next time it turns out to be even better. So I don't know if it's just like a present day bias that we have, or if it's true. I have to look back. But I personally felt like we touched upon so many different topics. You did a fantastic job both in your papers and in your answers, and I want to thank you again for that. Also, a lot of thanks to Eva and to Claire, who were behind the scenes, who helped you set up and who answered some questions in the chat. And thank you to everyone. Sorry that we didn't get to most of the questions. There's 21 questions, so sorry about that, not reaching so many questions.
Yeah, if I didn't get to your questions, you can email me or message me on Twitter or contact me in any way. I think Ida can share that information with you.
I think Claire always actually traditionally shares the ask a question area and the chat if in case a speaker wanted. She's our guru in the Claire and Eva are our gurus in that domain. So happy to also send you.
welcome to the curse of being interesting.
The evil laughter and the dark room, John, that was perfect.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Great stuff. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great weekend.